From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Jason Steinhauer, and I'm a program specialist with the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. Before we begin today's program, I'll ask you to take a moment and check your cell phones and other electronic devices, and please set them to silent. Thank you. I'll also make you aware that this afternoon's program is being filmed for placement on the Kluge Center website, as well as our YouTube and iTunes channels. I encourage you to visit our website, loc.gov/Kluge, which has other lectures delivered by current and former Kluge scholars, including several on the history of India and its relationship to the United States. Today's lecture is presented by the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. The Kluge Center is a vibrant scholar center on Capitol Hill that brings together scholars and researchers from around the world to stimulate and energize one another, to distill wisdom from the library's rich resources, and to interact with policymakers and the public. The center offers opportunities for senior scholars and postdoctoral fellows, as well as doctoral candidates, to do research in the Library of Congress collections. We also offer free public lectures and programs, such as this one, and we administer the Kluge Prize, which we will award in 2015, which recognizes lifetime achievement in the field of the study of humanity. For more information about the Kluge Center, I encourage you to visit our website. I also encourage you to sign up for our RSS email list here in the front to learn about future programs and opportunities for you to conduct your own research. I might also add that we've recently launched a new blog which showcases research conducted in the Library of Congress collections, so I encourage you to check out our blog as well. It's blogs.loc.gov/Kluge, and the blog is called Insights. Today's lecture is titled B.R. Ambedkar, get that right? Yeah. The Life of the Mind and a Life in Politics. Our speaker is AnanyaVajpaye, now concluding her tenure as a Kluge Fellow here at the John W. Kluge Center. Ananya's research investigates the life and influence of one of modern India's founding fathers, B.R. Ambedkar, political thinker, jurist, and principal architect of the Constitution of India. With India's emergence onto the world stage as a political, economic, and military power, it is a wonder to recall that it was fewer than 70 years ago, within the recent past, that modern-day India became an independent nation. Ambedkar's leadership was pivotal in the formation of the world's largest democracy, yet no complete intellectual biography has been produced since his death. That is the project that brings Ananya to the Library of Congress, which holds somewhere in the range of 400 to 500 titles by and about Ambedkar in English, Marathi, and several other languages, as well as a vast collection of materials on the Indian Constitution, electoral politics in post-colonial India, the caste system, and so on. Today, we will get a preview of Ananya's forthcoming work and a glimpse into her research in the library's rich holdings. AnanyaVajpaye is a fast-rising scholar who works at the intersection of intellectual history, political theory, and critical philology. She was educated at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, at the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, and earned her PhD at the University of Chicago. She is taught at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and at the University of Venice, Italy. She is based at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in New Delhi and is also a Global Ethics Fellow with the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. She has been a Senior Fellow with the American Institute of Indian Studies and a Kluge Fellow here at the John W. Kluge Center of the Library of Congress. Her first book, Righteous Republic, The Political Foundations of Modern India, was named a Book of the Year 2012 by The Guardian and The New Republic, and received the prestigious Thomas J. Wilson Memorial Prize from Harvard University Press, among many accolades. Her second book, The Biography and Intellectual History of Ambedkar, is the project that brings her here to the library. So please join me in welcoming AnanyaVajpaye.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming out on this cold day. Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar, the subject of my next book, is one of those figures in the history of modern India about whom many people know a little bit and very few understand anything much. Most educated Indians could tell you that he was a leader of the so-called low caste and outcast communities called Dalits, formerly known by the odious and now unconstitutional term untouchables. He played a prominent role in the making of India's liberal constitution of 1950 as a member of the Constituent Assembly and the chairman of the drafting committee. Fewer Indians might also be aware that Ambedkar founded a sect of Protestant Buddhism called the Navayana, literally the new way or the new vehicle. In recent years, other highlights of his life, which spanned the years from 1891 to 1956, are slowly becoming common knowledge. That he was very highly educated, with graduate degrees from Columbia University and the London School of Economics. That he was a scholar as much as a politician, and wrote several learned books. That he was a younger contemporary of Gandhi, and that the two did not see eye to eye. The phrases founding father in the American sense and maker of modern India have become popular in the last 5 to 7 years, signaling, without really substantively deepening, our casual perception of his historic role. Those who follow him as Dalits, as neo-Buddhists, as political activists, the faithful, if you will, in whatever be the reason for their adherence to his persona or his ideas, refer to Ambedkar as Baba Sahib, an address used with as much respect and affection as Mahatma or Bapu for Mohandas Gandhi. Not everyone knows much about Ambedkar, but many who do know him or of him believe in him passionately and speak of him with the kind of fervor normally reserved for religious figures, prophets, saints, those who uttered revelations, and those who brought deliverance. Baba Sahib Ambedkar is one of the most luminous figures in modern Indian history, and it is about him that I set out to write a book about 3 years ago. Of course, I'm only just beginning. My talk today is titled The Life of the Mind and a Life in Politics. And this title reflects a dilemma that has dogged me for the past year and a half at least, which is, should my book be an intellectual biography or a complete biography? I have vacillated between these two options and as a result made very little progress on either one. The problem, of course, is that both kinds of biographies, intellectual and political, are equally possible to write. There are many viable ways to tackle a life such as Ambedkar's. One could, for example, go systematically through all the books that he wrote on topics as varied as the evolution of the caste system, currency and finance in British India, Pakistan and the partition of India, Buddhism, untouchability, comparative constitutionalism, minorities and federalism, and numerous other subjects in culture and politics, anthropology and history, law and jurisprudence, religion and society. The breadth of his interests and the depth of his knowledge were truly astounding. Then again, one might equally chart a life decade by decade, from the 1890s to the 1950s. Ambedkar's personal narrative can be braided together with important episodes in the history of Indian nationalism, as well as the interventions of other significant figures of the times. Events in which he intersects with India's political history during this momentous period could easily be made to act as the vertebrae in the spine of my account. One conceivable approach that is extremely au courant is to build an entire life around Ambedkar's disagreement with Gandhi, an interpersonal conflict between the two giants of the age that adumbrates and highlights much of the debate about how to address social inequality and how to ensure social justice in India throughout the 20th century and into the present moment. But here's the thing. My experiments with biography as a genre that as an intellectual historian I'm not necessarily familiar with or adept at have led me to realize that just because the elements of a life could be ordered in a certain way doesn't mean that that order will yield any special insight into the significance of this life. Mere viability is an insufficient criterion for this or that arrangement of the constitutive elements, I beg your pardon. What we need is to be able to grasp the intrinsic raison d'etre of this person's life as a historically consequential narrative. We need a structure that is true, not just to the sequence of veridical events that unfolded for and around this man, in homogeneous empty time, as it were, but more importantly, true to the character of this man, that is, to his motivations and ambitions, his capabilities and shortcomings, his failures and achievements. We need to be able to pick up an inanimate archive and make it sing, like a properly tuned musical instrument. We have to produce or at least approximate to the music that was this particular human existence, with its duration, its pattern, its crescendos and silences. Believe me when I tell you that until about 3 weeks ago, when I happened to have a conversation with a friend who lives in Paris, studies medieval Italy, and knows nothing of India, the music of Ambedkar's life had eluded me entirely. In the last months, I have made every possible type of chapter outline and bibliography, written multiple grant proposals and fellowship applications, including the one that brought me here, typed out book summaries and conference papers, but in my head I just couldn't hear what a life of Ambedkar would sound like. What would be its major notes and minor keys? How would it resonate with the questions that are most important for Indian modernity, democracy, equality, and justice? And even more crucially, what would Ambedkar's life in my telling add to the quest for human flourishing that we all hope guides in some very fundamental way our scholarly efforts and literary endeavors? So have I finally got it? I hope so. But at any rate, let me share with you whatever it is that I think I have finally understood at long last. Ambedkar's life, as I now see it, was punctuated by a series of setbacks and disappointments, each of which propelled him towards loftier goals, more difficult challenges, and stronger assertions of the will to overcome inimical circumstances and a hostile world. He was born in April 1891 in the Mahar caste of Maharashtra in Western India. This made him, in the still traditional Hindu environment of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, an untouchable. He was gifted with extraordinary intellectual powers, an ambitious father, encouraging teachers, and a royal benefactor, all of which together ensured that he went to college in Bombay and then won a scholarship to Columbia University, a first for anyone of his background. But despite these talents, advantages, and lucky breaks, and despite his innate drive, Ambedkar's childhood and early youth were marred by visceral experiences of the prejudice, bigotry, and violence of an untouchable existence. He couldn't sit next to his upper caste classmates. He was denied food and water for long days at school because his very touch was considered polluting. He was not permitted to study Sanskrit at university because of his ritually debased caste status. Instead, he majored in English and Persian, which was just as well. And his everyday life was riddled with the insults, segregation, and physical abuse that was routine for members of his caste. Nevertheless, at the recommendation, interestingly, of a couple of his Brahmin professors, the scion of the nearby princely state of Baroda, the Gaikwar Maharaja, decided to fund his higher studies. In the late summer of 1913, the young man found himself in Morningside Heights on West 114th Street between Broadway and Amsterdam, very far indeed from India and its cruel and senseless humiliations. With the perseverance and grit so characteristic of his temperament, Ambedkar raced through an MA and a PhD in anthropology and political economy, writing master's and doctoral theses that would in very short order be published as his first scholarly article and book, respectively. His advisor was one Edwin Seligman, but as luck would have it, who should be spending those years on Columbia campus but John Dewey, the great American educationist, pragmatist, and liberal philosopher who was associated mostly with the University of Chicago. Details of their initial encounter are not known and cannot be reconstructed, thanks to a lacuna in the archive that I will explain in a minute. But Dewey remained a part of Ambedkar's thinking and life all through. The two men died 2 years apart, in 1954 and 1956 respectively. Dewey by then was a very old man, and Ambedkar only 65 years of age. Ambedkar's amazing progress sent him next to the LSE, where he began a second MA in the fall of 1916. In 1917, Ambedkar was abruptly summoned back to India. It seems that the Gaikwar had all along intended his scholarship as a loan, to be repaid through service in the Maharaja's employ. Ambedkar was understandably unhappy to have his studies rudely interrupted, and his bursary recast as a debt. He booked his luggage on a separate ship than the one that he was on from London back to Bombay, and as it happened, that other vessel was torpedoed by a German submarine, taking with it his entire painstakingly built library, all his notes, papers, and writings, and even his doctoral thesis at Columbia that he then had to rewrite for his final award of the degree. So this is why we don't know much about his years in New York, except from whatever little he may have said about them later on in his life. He was rudely reminded of a dependent family back at home. His father had died, and he had a young wife and child. I should mention that Ambedkar had been married off, as was customary in those days, at the young age of 17 to a girl of 9, about 11 years prior to this return home. Things only got worse, though, when he arrived in Gujarat to serve as the Maharaja's military secretary. No one would rent him a room or a house. No one wanted to share office space with him. Once more, he got no water to drink, nor tea, nor lunch with his colleagues, nor dinner with his landlord, who only admitted him to his boarding house under a false identity as a Parsi gentleman. He couldn't even get a lamp at night to be able to read in his room after the workday. For all his qualifications as the most educated individual in the whole Principality of Baroda, he was right back where he had started, and untouchable. The story is that one day he was discovered and thrown out of his hostel and spent the night in a municipal park under a tree, burning with humiliation very much like the young Gandhi 30 years earlier, who had been offloaded from a train at Pietermaritzburg station in Natal, South Africa, on a winter's night in June 1893 for being a black man, even if a qualified lawyer and the owner of a first-class ticket. Gandhi had faced the white colonial master's racism. Ambedkar was insulted by his fellow Indians, his fellow Hindus. Neither man ever forgot the lesson that he learned on that fateful night, and both these experiences proved to be life-changing in each case. Angry and frustrated, Ambedkar quit his job and went back to Bombay to rejoin his family. Fortunately, he was appointed a professor of political economy at Sydenham College, and in 3 or 4 years he had saved enough money to go back to London to resume his studies. Between 1920 and 23, he earned a second MA and a second PhD at the LSE, as well as a law degree from Gray's Inn in London. He even spent a few months at the University of Bonn in Germany, working towards a PhD in Indology, the very same subject that he had been disallowed from studying as an undergraduate 15 years earlier because Sanskrit was supposedly off limits to persons of low caste. This overcompensation reveals the extent to which he took his shoddy treatment in India to heart, and also suggests a desperate desire not to have to go home and deal with the reality of discrimination that wasn't going anywhere, no matter how firmly Ambedkar turned his back, no matter how high above his birth he climbed through the sheer dint of hard work. Later on in one of his writings, he described Hindu society as a tower divided into the floors of caste, without windows to look out and without stairs to carry one up or down from the level at which one happened to be born. He could also have added that there were no doors for entry or exit. By mid-1923, he really did run out of time and money, and he had to come back to Bombay. In the remainder of the 1920s, the ridiculously overqualified 32-year-old was called to the bar, started a practice at the Bombay High Court, began publishing his various scholarly dissertations, was appointed professor at the Government Law College, where he would eventually become a named chair and later principal, was nominated to the Bombay Legislative Council, and ran more than one popular journal and community organization dealing with the rights of untouchables. He became the face of a social group that was at last awakening to its political identity. But really, he was the one who almost single-handedly was defining the contours of this identity and aggressively politicizing it, at least in the city of Bombay and in the broader context of the Bombay presidency. It was as though he was determined to deploy the surfeit of his own qualifications and capabilities to make up for the collective backwardness reinforced by centuries of oppression of his most wretched brethren. Ambedkar launched a series of agitations, mobilizations, and campaigns to demand that untouchables be allowed to access public goods like drinking water from tanks and wells, that they be allowed to move freely and in a dignified manner without threat to life or limb in public spaces like roads and parks, and that they be granted entry into sacred temples to exercise the right to worship therein just like other Hindus. Predictably, caste Hindus, even liberal, educated, and anglicized urban people, were intransigent. Ambedkar would take one step forward and have to backtrack 2 steps. Temples were claimed to be private property. Tanks were ritually purified after untouchables had taken water from them. In December 1927, he publicly burned a copy of the ancient Hindu scripture, the law code of Manu, which enshrines the archaic punishments and prohibitions against low castes and untouchables in the holy language of Sanskrit. This period is critical because Ambedkar had to walk a fine line between, on the one hand, formulating and voicing the needs of his desperately poor and almost entirely illiterate community, not only to others, but also in many ways to the very people whom he was leading and representing, and on the other hand, chiming in with the broader anti-colonial sentiment that was mounting by the day, thanks to the Indian National Congress, whose leadership happened to be entirely upper caste and upper class, but not its following, which was genuinely massive and cut across all sections of society. Ambedkar also had to work with the British authorities, howsoever unpopular this may have made him with the nationalists, if and when he felt that this was the best course of action to protect the interests of untouchables. The British in turn were cautious with him and frequently rewarded him for his cooperation with them, even in an atmosphere of strident anti-colonialism led by hugely charismatic figures like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru. Thus, Ambedkar found himself giving evidence before various government commissions and committees, introducing radical bills in the Bombay Legislative Council, and appointed as a representative of the untouchables at 3 historic roundtable conferences held between 1930 and 32 to enable the British, the Congress, and other third parties like himself to sit down and discuss increasingly voluble Indian demands for self-determination. Matters came to a head when Ramsay MacDonald proposed a communal award, creating separate electorates for Muslims on the one hand and untouchables on the other. Ambedkar was in favor, Gandhi was opposed. Ambedkar saw untouchables as a type of minority, like Muslims. Gandhi felt that the British machinations had already divided Indians into Hindus and Muslims, and now threatened to further break Hindus into upper castes and so-called depressed classes, or lower castes and untouchables. Neither man yielded. Gandhi raised the stakes by going on a fast unto death if his views were not respected. He pledged to educate, harangue, and shame caste Hindus until they ceased and desisted from practicing untouchability. He proclaimed himself the spokesman of untouchables. Public opinion and political pressure were unequivocally in Gandhi's favor. Ambedkar had to back down and enter into the so-called Pune Pact in September 1932 to keep untouchables together with other Hindus within joint electorates. This agreement broke Gandhi's fast, but it also broke Ambedkar's faith in Gandhi, in the Congress, and in caste Hindus. By 1935, Ambedkar was done with civil disobedience, with negotiation, with compromise. From his perspective, all tactics to claim and gain basic minimum dignity for untouchables had failed. The caste system could not be cleaned up. It had to be annihilated. Hinduism could not be reformed. Those who hated caste had simply to cease being Hindus. In October 1935, at a small place called Yola, outside the city of Nasik in northern Maharashtra that I went to visit last year, Ambedkar declared at a public meeting that he might have been born a Hindu, but he would not die one. He did not himself fully know at that time exactly what this statement implied or entailed, what it was that he would or he could do concretely to redeem his vow, but he put it out there and he never looked back. In my view, recently developed, Ambedkar's life has two phases. The initial phase climaxes at the Yola speech in October 1935. The final phase climaxes at another speech made in Nagpur in central India in October 1956. On the latter occasion, Ambedkar converted to Buddhism, redeeming his promise not to die as a Hindu. He did in fact die hardly 6 weeks later on December 6, 1956. The second phase of Ambedkar's life, which lasted 21 years, saw him rise steadily in public prominence and political power. Having made it clear that he had been arm-twisted into the Pune Pact, he openly parted ways with Mahatma Gandhi. This seemed to give him the confidence to strike out on a completely different path towards dignity and freedom, at least for untouchables, than the one being pursued by Congress nationalists under Gandhi's leadership. In 1936, Ambedkar launched the Independent Labour Party, and in 1937 his party contested and won 17 seats in the first provincial elections held after the Government of India Act of 1935, which gave to India partial political autonomy as a giant step towards complete independence from British rule. Throughout the late 1930s, he was active in the labor union politics of Bombay's textile mill workers, making the obvious connection between the rights of workers and those of the depressed classes. Ambedkar was practically the only one in all of modern India's political history to think seriously about solidarities of caste and class. On the whole, India's left parties, from the colonial era into post-colonial times, have failed quite miserably in this regard. Throughout this period, Ambedkar wrote, travelled, lectured, and published like a fiend. In 1937, he was elected to the Bombay Legislative Assembly, and in 1942, he was appointed Labour member on the Viceroy's Executive Council. That same year, he also founded the All India Scheduled Castes Federation, which was modelled on the American NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People. In 1946, he was elected as a member of the Constituent Assembly, and in April 1947, Article 17 of the draft Constitution abolished untouchability. In mid-August of 1947, India was decolonized, leading to the creation of the new independent nation-states of India and Pakistan via the largest episode of bloodshed and displacement in human history in what was technically not a war, namely the partition of British India. Barely a few days after independence, in late August 1947, Ambedkar was made the chairman of the drafting committee of the Constituent Assembly. Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated in January 1948. In November of 1949, Ambedkar made 3 historic speeches to the Constituent Assembly, announcing the completion of work on the Constitution and talking about how the new nation might move forward into its post-colonial future. On January 26, 1950, India's Constitution was promulgated. The preamble to this document, which has been modified a bit from its original form, now states, "We, the people of India, having solemnly resolved to constitute India into a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic, and to secure to all its citizens justice, social, economic, and political, liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith, and worship, equality of status and opportunity, and to promote among them all fraternity, assuring the dignity of the individual and the unity and integrity of the nation, in our Constituent Assembly, this 26th day of November 1949, do hereby adopt, enact, and give to ourselves this Constitution." Please note that justice precedes liberty, liberty precedes equality, and equality precedes fraternity in the order of prominence. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar, born a despised Mahar in British India about 60 years before this day, was the first law minister in Prime Minister Nehru's cabinet and a leading contributor to the text of the Constitution. The Constitution, which not only abolished untouchability, but also included various measures of positive discrimination to safeguard the rights of groups that were now being called scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. It's really difficult to overstate the distance covered in the exact duration of this man's life, not just by him, but by Indian society and polity. Not done yet, Ambedkar, who finally was in the right position to do something about Hinduism as a whole, and not just the rights of untouchables, now tried to present and push through the newly constituted parliament a piece of legislation called the Hindu Code Bill. If passed and enacted into a law, this was intended to reform Hindu marriage, property, and inheritance away from caste-based and patriarchal customs and conventions and bring the Hindu community in line with the new framework of democratic citizenship, with guarantees of equality, dignity, justice, and adult franchise for men and women alike, and for all Indian citizens regardless of caste, religion, or gender. The bill failed. Outrageously, unbelievably, almost contradicting history itself, Ambedkar faced the very same wall that he had stood in front of in Baroda in 1917 when he was thrown out of his quarters despite being the Maharaja's military secretary, in Mahad in 1927 where the Chowdhury tank was purified by caste Hindus after untouchables had drunk water from it, in Pune in 1932 where Gandhi threatened to die rather than give up on the caste system, in Yola again in 1935 where Baba Sahib knew that he had reached the limits of his tolerance. Once again, Ambedkar resigned his position, this time as law minister. He quit Nehru's government. And he set out to finally try to figure out what it was, if not politics, if not polemics, if not legislation, if not legal and juridical reform, that would jolt Indian society out of its age-old habits of caste hierarchy, differentiation, and discrimination, and make good the promise that he had first announced at Yola in 1935. From 1950, Ambedkar turned in earnest to Buddhism. Actually, in a long, slow process of preparation, already throughout the 1940s, Ambedkar had written 3 books. One was about the idea of Pakistan as a nation of Indian Muslims. Could untouchables be thought about as a religious or social minority vis-a-vis caste Hindus in the same way as Muslims? And would that then entitle them to a separate nationality? In a sense, this was a return to the problem first opened up by the question of separate electorates, which had led to the falling out with Gandhi back in the early 1930s. The second book that he wrote was a history of the Shudras, the lowest layer in the 4-tier Hindu caste system. And a third book was about the history of the untouchables, lower still than the Shudras, the 5th layer, as it were, beyond the pale of a 4-fold hierarchy. These 2 monographs together effectively revised the social history of India as such. Ambedkar argued that Shudras had fallen from higher caste status on account of their conflict with the top-tier Brahmins in deep antiquity. Similarly, untouchables had fallen from Buddhism into slavery, also on account of their challenge to the hegemony of Brahmins thousands of years ago. For Shudras and untouchables to struggle for a dignified identity now and to insist on equal status was in fact not to ask for something new, but to reclaim their original and rightful place in the Indian social world. For untouchables especially, to embrace Buddhism would mean a return to their primary identity as Buddhists, and a rejection of centuries of being treated like enslaved, broken men, an evocative phrase that was coined by Ambedkar. The struggle over terminology was in fact absolutely central to the Gandhi-Ambedkar conflict. If everyone agreed that untouchable and untouchability had to go, whether as word or practice or attitude, how then to refer to the communities that nevertheless had been at the receiving end of this peculiar form of physical and psychological violence for hundreds, if not thousands of years? Gandhi proposed to rebaptize them Harijans, the children of God, for all are equal in the eyes of God. Ambedkar called them Dalits, literally those who are crushed, ground down, broken into pieces. Gandhi's nomenclature was preferred by pious and guilt-racked caste Hindus. Ambedkar's angry and defiant word captured the burning desire for self-respect in those who had been oppressed for too long. In time, Ambedkar's Dalit became standard usage and Harijan faded away into history. But even today, these two terms connote opposed ideas of social justice that are prevalent in India. Two kinds of caste Hindus are either in denial about or very defensive about continuing forms of caste prejudice. One is religious Hindus, who think that their religion is essentially benign and oriented towards the ultimate liberation from this world and its attachments. For them, being Hindu means having your sights set on transcending the materiality of everyday life and its matrices of power, and not dominating or defeating your fellow human beings. Another kind of Hindu is liberal, secular, and egalitarian, and has an equally blind faith in the Constitution of India and in the elaborate structures of affirmative action that are hardwired into the post-colonial state and electoral democracy in India. And mind you, India is the world's largest democracy, thanks, of course, in great measure to Ambedkar himself. Neither type of upper caste subject quite understands the residual rage that characterizes the Dalit political stance. But the truth is that inequality, or worse, even untouchability, did not simply melt away in 1947 at the achievement of independence or in 1950 by constitutional fiat. Just this past week, Indian newspapers have been abuzz with the results of a new survey by the National Center for Applied Economic Research, the NCAER, that show unequivocally that Indians still practice untouchability. What does this mean? In one sense, we can't use this word, but in another sense, the practice is rampant. This means that most people will not marry outside their caste, or will disapprove of their children marrying outside caste. Caste still structures and determines social interactions, besides all kinds of indicators and predictors of poverty, nutrition, education levels, employment, longevity, quality of life, you name it. Some professions are still unclean and associated with Dalit communities exclusively. Some indices of power and privilege remain as out of bounds for Dalits today as they were 80 or 90 years ago for the double doctorate lawyer B.R. Ambedkar. Middle-class people will hire Dalits to clean their bathrooms, but never allow them to handle food in their kitchen. Nor will masters and servants ever think to eat together. When asked, of course, they will cite hygiene and never caste as the reason. I do hope that those of you who are Americans are thinking all the time about how racism, covert and overt, persists in this country without my having to spell out obvious parallels between race and caste. Anyway, Ambedkar in his wisdom somehow understood that caste was not going away. So after exhausting all the options, he turned at last in the 1950s to the idea of religious conversion for Dalits, and specifically conversion to Buddhism as the religion that they ought to consider next. He thought through Sikhism, Christianity, and Islam as well, and rejected them all for reasons that I don't have time to develop here today, though I have discussed them at length in my first book, Righteous Republic, The Political Foundations of Modern India. Ambedkar began traveling around India, South Asia, Southeast Asia, visiting monasteries and speaking with monks and scholars of the various orders of Buddhism still extant. 2,500 years ago, in the Gangetic floodplain and on the foothills of the Himalaya, Siddhartha Gautama the Buddha revolted against Hindu orthodoxy and showed a different path towards equality, compassion, and liberation. His was the first revolution, as Ambedkar called it, against the caste system, and the time had come to recapture that legacy and that potentiality once more. Since it was the original Buddhists who had over time been reduced to untouchables, modern-day Dalits had to take back the true history of protest and radical egalitarianism that was theirs all along to claim and reclaim. To this end, Ambedkar wrote a book. He called it the Buddhist Bible, titled The Buddha and His Dhamma. Ambedkar carefully studied the Buddhist canon, available in a mixture of Indian, Chinese, and Sri Lankan traditions for the most part, and even taught himself how to read Pali, an ancient Buddhist language that was a sister to the Brahmin's Sanskrit, so as to be able to draw on the textual resources that he needed. Eventually, he wrote a Pali dictionary, a Pali English dictionary. But as should be clear to you by now, Ambedkar was no ordinary reader or exegete. he didn't just absorb the Buddhist teachings and arguments. In fact, he turned them upside down. So, for starters, he rejected the Four Noble Truths. He took the centerpiece of the entire architecture of Buddhist thought, the category of dukkha or suffering, de-linked it from the individual's fate or deeds, debunked the notion that we suffer because of our karma, which makes suffering somehow our own fault, something we bring upon ourselves, and reinterpreted it to mean social suffering, the generalized immiseration attendant upon any social order that is premised on social inequality. In other words, the root of India's suffering is caste, and the end of suffering, which is the goal of Buddhist practice, is the new order that arises after the annihilation of caste. Enlightenment, in Ambedkar's view, is not an individual's nirvana, not even of a charismatic individual like the Buddha or like Baba Sahib himself, perhaps, but the building of an enlightened society that is founded on liberty, equality, fraternity, but also compassion, goodwill, and justice. You can tell how Ambedkar married ancient Buddhist meanings of spiritual enlightenment with modern European meanings of political enlightenment. If this weren't revisionary enough, he claimed a parity between the monastic order and lay persons. In other words, he debunked the primacy of the Sangha or the monastic community and opened the doors to all those seeking to enter into the Buddhist fold to live as full and equal members of an egalitarian social body. Ambedkar was sick with diabetes, heart disease, and nervous exhaustion by 1956, the last year of his life. Nevertheless, he stayed up nights and he raced to complete his manuscript, which was only published posthumously in 1957. On October 14 and 15, 1956, in a place called Nagpur, which is ironically otherwise the headquarters of the RSS, the parent organization of India's Hindu right, Ambedkar conducted a spectacular public ritual of a kind that has never been seen in the entire recorded history of Buddhism. He had a very senior monk pronounce the 3 refuges and the 5 undertakings, and Ambedkar and his second wife, this Brahmin doctor, his own doctor, whom he had married in 1948, 13 years after the premature death of his first wife, these 2 individuals repeated after the monk and became Buddhists. Almost 500,000 Dalits who were present on those 2 days followed Ambedkar down the new way, the Navayana. Significantly, and again, in a radical departure from tradition, Ambedkar himself devised 22 additional vows, most of which spelled out how converts would reject and eschew Hindu and especially caste-based practices as part of their new faith, or their very old faith now recovered from the oblivion of history. In my earlier book, I had argued that the revisionary hermeneutics of Ambedkar's book, The Buddha and His Dhamma, the theater of mass conversion, the setting aside of the Four Noble Truths and the reinterpretation of dukkha or suffering, and most of all these 22 vows to negate Hinduism rather than to positively embrace Buddhism, taken together, showed that Ambedkar's was a political gesture and not a change of heart. In other words, I felt that he was in search of a different kind of identity for Dalits, legible within the grammar of modern religious politics, especially as it is understood in India, but that Buddhism in any normal sense of that term had really very little to do with it. Buddhism fulfilled many criteria that other religions did not fulfill to Ambedkar's satisfaction, and he was very systematic in the process of comparison and choice. Even so, he had to render Buddhism almost unrecognizable as itself for it to work for the purposes that he had in mind, purposes that were overwhelmingly political and not spiritual. I must confess that I have now changed my mind. In the perspective of the totality of Ambedkar's life, the conversion reads differently now to me than it did earlier. When I was comparing Ambedkar's relationship to Indian traditions of various kinds with that of other founding figures like Gandhi, Tagore, and Nehru, who had their own demons to deal with but were nevertheless nowhere near as agonized or agonistic in their relationship to the past as Ambedkar was. Here is Ambedkar in Nagpur on October 15, a day after his conversion in 1956. He says, "I'm surprised at only one thing. Much discussion has been going on everywhere, but not even one man has asked me, why did you accept Buddhism? Putting aside all other religions, why was this religion accepted? In any movement to change religion, this is the main question. When one makes a change in religion, one has to test which religion, why should we take it? The movement to leave the Hindu religion was taken in hand by us in 1935, when a resolution was made in Yola. Even though I was born in the Hindu religion, I will not die in the Hindu religion. This is the oath that I made earlier. Yesterday I proved it true. I'm happy. I'm ecstatic. I have left hell. This is how I feel." A bit later he said, "Religion is a very necessary thing for the progress of mankind. I know that a sect has appeared because of the writings of Karl Marx. According to their creed, religion means nothing at all. Religion is not important to them. They get breakfast in the morning of bread and cream and butter and chicken legs. They get undisturbed sleep. They get to watch movies, and that's all there is. This is their philosophy. I'm not of that opinion. My father was poor, and therefore we did not get comforts of that kind. No one has ever lived a life as hard as mine. How hard a man's life can be without happiness and comforts, that I know." And finally he said, "Some people say, why did you take so much time to get converted? What have you been doing all these days? The question is important. The task of teaching religious understanding is not easy. It is not the work of one man. No man in the world has as much responsibility as I. If I get a long enough life, I will finish my appointed task." Well, he got just enough time to finish his appointed task. He staged the conversion for himself and his people. He finished his book, and 6 weeks later, on December 6, 1956, B.R. Ambedkar died at his house in Delhi, which is, by the way, just a 10-minute walk from my office there now. His followers called it not a death, but a Mahaparinirvan, the great ultimate enlightenment, a modern-day enlightenment, a modern-day liberation. In closing, I want to return to my friend whom I had mentioned as being responsible for helping me to overcome the dilemma between writing an intellectual life and a complete biography of Ambedkar. I told you that he works on the history of Renaissance Italy. He writes about popes and the Medici, and he knows very little about India. When I recounted the story of Ambedkar's life to him quickly, just racing through the high points and skipping the details, he cut me short towards the very end of my recitation. "The triumph of the will," he said, "from untouchable to Übermensch." I looked at him startled. "You say that Ambedkar had read a lot of Western political philosophy, right? So likely he knew his Nietzsche?" I wasn't sure. "He rose from the dirt and he became a founding father of the Indian nation, the author of India's constitution, and the creator of a totally new sect of Buddhism. Does it not strike you that he was someone with a Nietzschean sensibility?" I had to leave that morning or I would have missed my flight back to DC. Yes, Ambedkar knew his Nietzsche, it turned out, and probably much better than any of his contemporaries and peers in Indian politics. But Ambedkar did not want to be a Übermensch. And given the era of fascism and Nazism that he lived through, his political maturity bookended by the 2 world wars, thank goodness for this. No, Ambedkar wanted something much more fundamental, much less megalomaniacal, much less overweening than the ancient prophet Zarathustra or his modern ventriloquist, Nietzsche. He wanted rather for himself and every Dalit to be recognized as fully, simply, and as only human. Not Superman, but just man, with everything that entails. Not man in the image of God, but not man as God on earth, but Rousseau's man, and Tom Paine's man, and Thomas Jefferson's man, and the Buddha's man, fully, inalienably, incontrovertibly human. Not beastly, not brutish, not subhuman, not some creature perpetually cast out of society into the hell that is inequality, but human. This Ambedkar demanded. I hope to tell my story as a story of how B.R. Ambedkar came to ask that man be cognizant of and respectful towards the humanity of his fellow men, regardless of the accident of birth. Regardless. Thank you. undoubtedly a theme that I would develop in a full-fledged book. And Ambedkar, was not in the minority opinion here, in the sense that Gandhi's views on modernity were not the views that carried the day for the Indian nation state. So Ambedkar was on the winning side of that debate, along with others like Nehru and so many of the leaders and makers of the modern nation state. But yes, and I've written about this actually extensively already. The kind of space that the village signified for Gandhi and for Ambedkar. I mean, they had opposite views on what the village meant. For Gandhi, it was the site of authenticity, an organic community, and essentially of Indian civilization as a kind of bulwark against Western modernity. But for Ambedkar, the village was a hellhole. It was the nursery of caste. The village was where the untouchable was never allowed to live, because he was always segregated to parts out to the wilderness outside the village. And that becomes a very important trope in the kind of building narrative of their disagreement over the years. I would definitely write about that, but I didn't necessarily have time to talk about it today. Please.
You mentioned that there's two versions of Buddhism, make Buddhism unrecognizable.
Yeah.
Does that have anything to do with the distinction between Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism, or did he come up with an entirely different?
He came up with a very different sect. It resembles none of the existing major schools of Buddhism, and
does it have to be? Are there
yes. So yes, I mean, literally on 1 or 2 days he converted many people, but then right after his death, through the work of many monks and others that were close to him personally, the count rose to about 4 million. But sadly, I mean, it plateaued off. It stabilized at around that, and the numbers have not necessarily over the years continued to grow. And there are many reasons for this, which I've also argued at great length in my earlier book, including certain distortions of how Buddhists are counted within the census and within the constitution, and how it impacts access to affirmative action, so that it may in fact be more beneficial to remain a scheduled caste than to become a Buddhist and forego certain kinds of positive discrimination. But Ambedkarite Buddhism is quite distinct doctrinally from other major schools of Buddhism which exist in India or in Sri Lanka, or Tibetan Buddhism, Burmese Buddhism, Thai, and so on.
Was he ever seriously interested in Christianity?
Yes, he was seriously interested in Christianity. He was very close friends with a bishop. For many years, he had a monthly dinner date with this bishop in Bombay. And the Christians and the Muslims were very interested in having him come to them. But ultimately, he rejected Christianity because he felt that it would be a politically inappropriate choice in a country that was trying to decolonize and get rid of its white masters and its legacy of European and Christian missionaries. In other words, as a religion, it may offer some advantages, but historically it came bundled together with colonialism, and he had to set it aside ultimately. His most, actually, this is something I really wanted to talk about, but I just didn't have time. His most interesting departure from Buddhism, apart from rejecting the Four Noble Truths, was that he did not buy the story of the shock, the disillusionment, and the great going forth of Siddhartha. In other words, the story of the three sites when Siddhartha, as a 29-year-old prince, for the first time sees an aging man, a sick man, and a corpse, and leaves his kingdom and his family and his prospects and his palace, and simply goes out into the unknown to try and find a different truth. Ambedkar found this to be unconvincing, and he said, how could he live to be 29 and not know what death is? Or how could this encounter with mortality result in, what was ultimately a movement for social reform? So he had a very pragmatic understanding of what might have motivated the Buddha. And this actually confused me a great deal. I failed to see Ambedkar's own Buddha-like journey as a result of various kinds of shocking encounters, because he so steadfastly refused to acknowledge that a shock of that kind could yield a spiritual awakening or an enlightenment. He also refused to acknowledge that about Gandhi. Gandhi too went through a spiritual crisis, and this is how he ended up writing Hind Swaraj. And this is something I've argued at great length in my book. But Ambedkar wouldn't grant, the spiritual nature of the journeys made by these two people, the Buddha and Gandhi, who in many ways were strangely similar to himself. And it's hard to see that he precisely denied the very similarity that helps us to understand him the best. I'm sorry, there were other questions, but
So I'm just interested in this event in August 1956.
October.
Of the 500,000 people who were there.
Yeah.
Were they mainly Maharashtrian Dalits? Question A. And secondly, would you see that as the beginning of the Dalit political movement? Really, what really started the spirit of the Dalit political movement? I know there was a lot of antecedent to that, but was that the point at which one can start tracing the movement's sort of forging ahead?
Yes and no. Yes, they were mostly Mahars. They were mostly Maharashtrians. They were mostly Dalits. Although other kinds of people must also have been present in such a large gathering. But we had a long history of Phule's movement in Maharashtra already in the 19th century. We had the entire non-Brahmin movement in southern India, with which Ambedkar had some intersections and from which he had some learnings. And because people were not really converting very actively to Ambedkarite Buddhism for a long period, through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and Ambedkar was in a sense in cold storage till a kind of revival began in the 90s. It's hard to say that this was somehow the birth of the Dalit movement. The Dalit Panthers came into existence in the late 60s, early 70s. Ambedkar also launched something called the Republican Party of India, which again had no activity for a long time. So I think the significance of that moment has to be read carefully by reading the ritual itself, which was a complete construction out of Ambedkar's imagination and which has no precedent anywhere in the history of the Buddhist world. And we have to read it, semiotically for what it is meant to signify. But its actual political consequences offer a different history, and the two don't necessarily align.
We'll have to leave it there. Please join me again in thanking Ananya.
I just want to take this opportunity actually to thank the Kluge Center and my colleagues and everybody who works at the Kluge Center, because there are so many, I can't even begin to list, but there are so many ways in which I was not thinking about this project before I came here. So many connections that were triggered off by materials that are American or that are peculiar to this library, and to other individuals who work here and with whom one has conversations. And it's really been an enriching and very, very unique sort of a research experience to try to do this work in this environment. And I'm very, very grateful, not only that I had the opportunity to come here, but that I was able to adjust my time in a way that worked for me, even if it caused inconvenience to the center itself. So thank you so much for making this possible.
And that is a great segue into my final notes, which is that we have 2 more events this week, which I hope that you'll join us for. Tomorrow at noon, one of our 2 Kislak Fellows in residence, Sarika Davies, will give a lecture on map making during the Renaissance and depictions of indigenous tribes and peoples on those maps. And then the following day, our Jameson Fellow from this past year, Kevin Kim, will return to the Library of Congress to give a lecture on Cold War America, and specifically Henry Wallace and Herbert Hoover's role in Cold War America. So I hope you'll join us for both those events. Information is on our website, and you can also sign up for our email list to learn more. So thanks again, and have a good rest of the evening.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.